The Nuzlocke. For over 10 years, this challenge has become the staple for taking baby games and turning them into a struggle of life and death. And while people mostly associate them with Pokemon, you can twist these suckers into nearly any game with collectible mortal lives. Like, say, this bastard. Limbus Company has been out for a year and a half now, and when compared to its two predecessors from Project Moon, is the pissest easy of the bunch. Hell, even fans of the game will say it's nowhere near too hard. And if you need proof, let me ask ya, would you seriously attempt a Nuzlocke of this?
Pay me. Fucking pay me. You'd have to pay me to Nuzlocke that game.
But for PM's youngest and most coddled child, adding permadeath is a great way to make the player think before they press the shiny win rate button. At least you would think. See, I've been trying to make this challenge since Limbus first launched, painstakingly calculating just what would add permadeath in a way that wasn't only hard, but made the game feel fresh. And once there was enough content to finally try it, I got some willing volunteers, and realized that if I subjected the world to this version, I'd be getting a visit from an arbiter. We had to grind live for hours, create separate checkpoints to make pulls for encounters, and made logs for which IDs were alive since this is not a Pokemon box. All of which were fully decided by luck since this is a gotcha, by the way. Seriously, how did I think that something that needed a burner Steam account could act as the foundation to a whole charity event? This is how it started, by the way. And, thank you. But if I wanted to make Limbus more challenging without overcomplicating it to hell and back, we'd need to build a more thoughtful Nuzlocke. And today, I'm happy to announce that not only does that Nuzlocke exist, but its first run up through Season 4 has already been completed. Not only that, but I believe it's flexible enough to keep this format even several Kantos from now. So Goons and Loons, I am happy to present to you how you can finally Nuzlocke Limbus Company. First off, we need to talk about the essential elements of the Nuzlocke, those being permadeath and limited encounters. In a Pokemon Nuzlocke, you'd get a chance at catching a Pokemon in every new area you run into. Combine that with the permadeath, and it gives you those warm fuzzies that make you think the mutant deer you found in your backyard is actually a life worth treasuring. But in Limbus, the encounters are nowhere near as easy to handle. Pokemon Nuzlockes that start with a fresh file can be completed in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, you give someone 50 hours with Limbus Company and they might not even be at the current Kanto or have most of the IDs. And if you white out, well, God forbid you even try to delete your save data. PM will just play a game of chicken with you and shut the game down, forcing you to keep it closed for a week before it actually deletes your save. And look, I know I'm not beating the sadism allegations anytime soon, but maybe making a Nuzlocke that stops you from playing for a week on loss is a bad idea. In other words, any Nuzlocke of Limbus will have to use your current account. And to avoid making the player keep track of IDs using a spreadsheet, this challenge won't have catch encounters. Instead, I'm stealing an idea from a YouTuber named Don Schnack, who made a Nuzlocke of Kirby Star Allies. Because hey, if I'm gonna steal video ideas from one YouTuber, what's one more on the pile? His system works by starting with all of the copy abilities and banning them if either he or any of his allies die while using them. Similarly, this challenge starts with having all the sinners and using permadeath on them rather than their IDs. And for those of you that can read but can't count, that means you start off with 12 lives. So that addresses our permadeath setup, but it also introduces a new problem. If you're not using alt accounts, that means you could avoid letting sinners die by making stacked teams at their max levels. And it's not much of a challenge if you can steamroll your way through the Applevore boss at almost 6 times its level. So to fix that, we're pulling a rule from the Hardcore Nuzlocke Handbook: level caps. In a Pokemon Nuzlocke, some versions will make the player keep their team from overleveling the next gym's strongest Mon. And for Limbus, we can use a similar model to keep the player from overleveling the whole team using the recommended level on each stage. But that causes another issue because, well, would you look at that? These levels don't go down! And since there's only a finite number of IDs in the game at any point, forcing people to only use IDs at the suggested level and under either means you're SOL or ruining your next Walpurgis Night to get new ones. So instead of making a level cap for every sinner, we're going to use a level cap for the entire team. In Pokemon, you usually just have one little idiot fighting against your opponent's tiny bastard for every fight. But in Limbus, you might have 5, 6, or even 7 sinners deployed and risking life and limb with every coin flip. So to me, Limbus is a game that cares more about team synergy, and rather than forcing each ID to be at a certain level, we can make the fights less brain dead by restricting the total levels of each team. And that is all done with this little formula. And I know what you're thinking, oh, but Frey, isn't making the player do math before team building every fight making things more complicated? And to that I say, shut up. Look, if you can understand how to use any of the Season 4 Eco and the kind of damage it deals, this is gonna be a walk in the park. Seriously though, this equation isn't as difficult as it may seem at first glance, and is the key to keeping this Nuzlocke simple. The formula works by setting the total level cap to be the product of the fight's recommended level multiplied by 1 less than the maximum number of deployed sinners. For example, let's say we want to pass through the fight at node 218, which is Ida and the Mariachis. This fight allows for up to 5 sinners and has a recommended level of 13. If we plug those into the formula, that turns into a team level cap of 52. So now, instead of forcing the player to have an entire team of IDs that are at level 13 and under, it's fine to just bring in one that's at level 45 and solo it out. Or you could bring in 2 level 25 IDs, or 5 level 10s if you really wanna. Look, you're smart. You get the idea. And for anyone wondering why this -1 is here, well, that's just to make things harder, or as I like to call it, playable. And now, in theory, we have all of the necessary rules for a Nuzlocke and are ready to start a new run from Kanto 1. But, in practice... So that's what suffering from success feels like. Yeah, as much as I love seeing a man with mommy issues and PTSD experience loss, a bold move by PM to make into a tutorial level, by the way, Kanto 1 is still the tutorial Kanto. Like, we tested this out in the first Nuzlocke. You literally cannot underlevel the Golden Apple boss by the time you reach it. And Faust gives you unskippable advice when you enter the dungeon. So whether it's from Verge or Faust or Herman, you're holding someone's hand during this part of the game. So, let's just skip this one. In fact, fuck it. Let's skip all the non-boss fights too. In many Pokemon Nuzlockes, deaths and tragedies occur most often during the least interesting fights. And that's not because these fights are hard, nah. It's because they're boring and done only for grinding. So you get the most upsetting losses in the least satisfying fights. And do we really want to risk that just to fight an extra 24 N-Corp Inquisitors? Besides, Pokemon already worked out this issue in only 5 words.
Take the rare candy pill.
And just like that, the wisdom of German engineering turned Pokemon games from a mental endurance test to an intense boss rush to bypass the 8 gyms, the Elite Four, and Champion, plus some other skids on the pavement. No additional trainers or grinding sessions necessary. So you can imagine that removing all non-boss encounters for Limbus means we only have a measly... and counting! This number also doesn't factor in the minor encounters during dungeons, so the real number of fights is higher than 50 as of now. So for the sake of your therapy bills, we're gonna stick to the essentials. And for anyone who's asking if I forgot about the prologue fights, if I said yes, would you really include them in your run? So that's it! That's everything we need to set up a Limbus Company Nuzlocke. You get 12 lives, a simple little level cap formula, and skip all the boring parts by starting with the first boss at node 218. Easy as that, right? Well, yes, but not really, because there are some incidentals that could ruin your run we still need to account for. For instance, some Kantos require a specific sinner to be in every fight to even start the battle. But under these rules, if that sinner died in a past Kanto, they can't be used, bringing the entire run to a halt. And if everyone has to be alive for that, then this isn't a Nuzlocke anymore, it's just a deathless run. And look, as much as I like a challenge, that defeats the entire purpose of the Nuzlocke. I'm not the first person to try and play Limbus Company in a harder way. Hell, there are entire channels focused on pushing ideas tease in the game's mechanics to its limits. But for me, the charm of the Nuzlocke doesn't come from only being hard. It's about adding enough challenge to make your actions matter without reducing your chances of victory to just luck or a test of patience. So while a deathless run does show a greater level of skill, I don't think the best stories come from seeing someone win all the time. To me, the best adventures will up your heart rate if you make a mistake that risks long-lasting consequences. So with that in mind, I've made the refraction clause. This is a mechanic pulled from the first Nuzlocke and easily the only good thing to come from it. If you are required to use a sinner that has previously died, you can deploy them with any ID and their base ego. But in battle, they can only use defensive skills. In lore terms, this means Dante may not revive the sinners in a Nuzlocke, but they can at least put them back together enough to use IDs and have reflexes. They may not have a mind anymore, but hey, this isn't the worst affront to nature in the city. And since this status is inspired by the webcomic Leviathan, we're calling this the refracted status. There are also some special cases for the refracted clause, where some fights will not only require a specific sinner to be included, but make you lose the whole thing if that sinner dies. In cases like this, if the required sinner was alive and not refracted during the fight, and then dies, well then they're now dead, no other special changes there. And on top of that, no other sinners are dead just because you lost. However, if the sinner was refracted during the fight and then dies, then you can sacrifice another sinner of your choosing to attempt that fight again. In other words, if you're in a fight where a refracted sinner is required, but is not required to stay alive to win it, they can die without any consequence. But if you're in a fight where a refracted sinner is required and is required to stay alive, then you can sacrifice another living sinner to attempt it again. And I know, to some people that sounded repetitive, and to other people it sounds stupid complicated because they haven't played up to the current story. But all you really need to do is look for an enemy that says, wins encounter if X dies, to know if you're in danger of committing double murder. There's also one other special case I'll throw up on screen now. It's really only relevant for one fight, but it happens to be a great opportunity for you to subscribe if you want to see more of me twisting Limbus's mechanics and lore into spaghetti that's so much more flavorful than anything PM could ever code. Also, there's a link to a bunch of images to easily explain how the Nuzlocke works in the description, as well as a changelog that'll be updated should anything come out that affects this challenge. Because if there is one thing I've learned to rely on as a Project Moon creator, it's my content aging like milk. And on that topic, we've got one more clause to cover, that being the chain battle clause. Yeah, PM really came in this season and made being put on a waitlist into a gameplay mechanic, huh? And that causes some trouble for our team level cap system if a total of 12 sinners can now take part. Because these aren't fights that are built for 12 sinners, these are fights that are built for 6 sinners who happen to be the most expendable. So far, it's come up a total of 3 times with varying levels of difficulty. And the local dog on the throne is saying that we should expect him in more story battles. So I gotta account for these if the Nuzlocke's gonna still be relevant in Kanto 7. But as the old saying goes, there are 2 kinds of people in this world. Those who can work with incomplete data, and Gretchen. So far, chain battles have come in 2 forms with one major difference. The first allows the player to select up to 12 sinners for the fight, while the second forces the player to use exactly 12. Luckily for us, the first kind is easy to solve for. Just select only the number of sinners deployed and follow the team level cap as usual. There's no need to change this at all. But then comes the second kind, which is the actual ordeal. If the game forces you to use all 12 sinners for a fight, then the formula gets a bit more complicated. This means we now have to add on one extra step to the level cap and multiply the original level cap by the result of 12 divided by the number of deployed sinners. This way, we take our original level cap and make it proportional to the total number of sinners in the fight. This method also accounts for whether or not there are chain battles in future Kantos that'll start you off with 7, 8, or more sinners. And hey, I hear ya. Some of y'all are looking at this and thinking, this is a lot more math to do just for one extra feature, ain't it? Isn't this past the point of keeping the challenge simple? And you're right. But ultimately, you're irrelevant. Because did you really think that I'd stop at making just a few silly images to explain this sucker? My baby? My product of twisting Ain's plan into an aberration of masochism? Dear goons and loons. Of course I made a spreadsheet! And it has all the level caps for every required encounter, including potential ones for chain battles in Kanto 7. You never needed to use this formula even once, you clowns! Just look at the encounter encounter and follow the level cap, and you're locked in tighter than Honglu wearing pink. So finally, I can say we have completed all of the essentials of designing a Limbus Company Nuzlocke that doesn't suck. All you gotta do is follow these 3 rules and keep these extra clauses just in case they come up. It's just that simple. But then, why isn't the video over? And doesn't it feel like we're forgetting something? Hey, so there's no easy way to say this. The Nuzlocke is fine as is. I wasn't lying when I said this covers all the essentials. But after playtesting it as a day oneer for Limbus, it was still pretty easy. Sure, I did die on the first encounter due to not knowing how to solo, but after picking up the basics, Kantos 2 through 4 went off without a hitch. And the challenge only got difficult after I forced myself to use an ID in Kanto 5 that is notoriously weak to what it throws at you. So while I do think this challenge makes Limbus Company more interesting, I think it's only that way to people who have finished the main story, but also don't have all the IDs and options that someone who's played for a long time would have. So to address that, I made some special variants for those that want to turn Limbus into a dick measuring contest. And in true Project Moon fashion, they're all measured by threat level. A quick disclaimer about these, I have not tested how hard they are, and I'm only speculating about what kind of player would find them entertaining. So your mileage may vary as we go through this list. First off, we've got the regular Nuzlocke, which I'm calling Zayin level. These are the rules with everything we've covered. Again, if you're someone that's only been around for a season or so and just finished the Inferno, this is the difficulty level I suggest you start at. Next up is Teth, which is historically barely worse than Zayin. As such, the only change here is that Teth bans you from using your daily clock powers. While this doesn't make the game much harder, I think it warrants its own level since we'll likely keep getting more of these abilities in the future, and it stops players from relying on a cheap escape for emergencies. Then there's Hey, which is the challenge I recommend for anyone that's more seasoned with Limbus. This sucker has all the above rules, but changes the team level cap. So now instead of subtracting 1 from the deployed center count, you subtract 2. And again, I've made an adjusted list in the team level cap spreadsheet so you don't have to do the math. But while I haven't played this, I consider this the max difficulty level that makes Limbus hard, but is still in the ballpark of normal Limbus. But that changes when we move over to VoV. Anyone that wants to try this level of challenge or above is okay with information overload and wants a real curveball. Like, hey, this level includes all of the above restrictions, but also you can only use either base or overclocked ego. And anyone that relies on Fluid Sac Faust or MFE Heathcliff knows that you've lost a major tool under this rule. Your SP's not gone forever though, since I'm still letting you keep your base ego. Just get used to giving Faust ennui. And lastly, we have Aleph level. There are some infamous Pokemon ROM hacks that were made for the purpose of being unreasonably difficult, even without Nuzlocking them. And while I think this still falls below that bar, the Aleph Limbus Nuzlocke was built with that same aspiration of being like a Pokemon Emerald Kaizo Nuzlocke. In addition to having the above rules, you can no longer use 3-0 IDs in any fight. Now, I don't know if this is possible, considering how a certain, let's call him King, likes to play. But unlike the rest of the Nuzlocke, this is the one time I'm willing to err on the unreasonably difficult or even impossible. So I hope with all 5 of these modes, you can see how they were made to indeed add restrictions, but not to the extent that the game becomes solely about chance or endless retries. But if none of these stick out to you, make your own! You could try doing a Nuzlocke with only specific factions, or get a friend to run a Soul Link with that makes you share sinners. Or even make your own ID encounters after every few fights if you really want to make this about ID lives. Cause what I'm offering to you, dear goons, is a template. I heavily believe in the death of the author and people taking an idea and just doing what they find the most fun with it. And if anyone has questions on the obscure details of this Nuzlocke in the comments, I'll do my best to answer them soon after the video comes out, and we'll continue to update the drive as we get more mechanics. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe, because next week we're pushing Limbus's combat even further by finding out if you can beat Refraction Railway while Gregor is pregnant.